So Daniela and I, Daniela Vancic, who's my co-editor of this one, were at a conference in Taiwan. And Daniela said there is this podcast you have to listen to. It kind of goes back, and I said I was trying to go for a jog because I felt tired. And you should listen to this podcast, which is about this new book. So I got figured out how to use my phone, as was explained to me, and I could then listen to this podcast, and on comes Selene and Caroline and your John, and you were talking about how it's completely underestimated the aspect of listening in politics. And I came back and I said to Daniela, did you listen to this particular podcast? No, I listened to the other one. No. It's about the Australian researchers and somebody from Southampton talking about listening. So she then listened to it and said, that's really good, that we really ought to do something along those lines. And then it was sort of simmered away, as it does, one of these things. Then when lockdown happened, we started revisiting this project again. We initially wanted to do a book on various aspects of internationalization of democracy, which of course you have written about, Nicole. The starting point really was when we approached the publishers. They said, well, how does democracy really work today? Is it about elections and so on? We thought, no, not just another book about election. So what we came up with this idea that we actually need elections. We need to have representative governments. We need to have political parties and all these things that we get grumpy about and we hate the politicians more than ever. By the way, we've always hated politicians. One of the lowest rankings of British politicians was Clement Attlee and Winston Churchill. Only 40% thought they were doing a good job. And just reminding us, because they were normally considered to be great people. So what we basically did with the book was that we tried to divide these complementary types of democracy, these things that also have to exist alongside representative democracy. We divided them into broadly speaking 3 categories, which are then in the various chapters of the book. There are the sort of formal institutions, which is referendums, the recall, and the recall, by the way, I find it a wonderful institution, whereas if you don't like a politician, you can gather signatures and then get them recalled. I could see several places where that might work, and it certainly has worked. Of course, in California, Arnold Schwarzenegger's political career was boosted by a recall. Arnold Schwarzenegger, by the way, is now a visiting professor of public policy at the University of Southern California.
Is recall removal?
Recall is removal, yeah. Revocation is also known as. Sack, basically. And currently in Britain, we have, if you're indicted with if you're found guilty of certain sort of fiddling your books on doing naughty things, then constituents can actually recall you. And one of the reasons why a certain individual called Boris Johnson has not decided to become prime minister, though he says he will win.
That's right.
He would have won if he did, which is the reason why I'm not entering Eurovision Song Contest. I would have won, obviously. But I decided not to, just for the sake of Djokovic and the other ones who they should have fun too. So basically, the recall is one of those institutions, and we have Julia Chapter on that. But then the problem with many political institutions is that, and then of course is that we don't just have the formal ones, the ones that are in constitutions. We also have the other one, the sort of informal one, which is citizens' juries, consultation, and even eDemocracy. And we wanted to present basically the state of the art along those lines. But I guess the problem for me, and this is where Daniela and I sort of slightly disagree, because Daniela comes from an activist background where things actually have to happen, and I come from a different background. I sort of tend to quote political white middle-aged men from the Middle Ages and formal political institutions, and that's not necessarily practical in real life politics. But one of the things we looked at when we were looking at this is how little sometimes political institutions can matter. And I'm afraid I'm going to quote a middle-aged white man here, But in a famous study of American democracy, and by implications also Mexican democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville traveled to Mexico as part of his long journey to America. And when he came to Mexico, he got a copy of the Constitution there because he thought that's a good starting point. And he realized that the Mexican Constitution in 1830 was exactly like the American Constitution, with one small difference, that it was written in Spanish. It had exactly the same institutions. And then he pondered why it was that the institutions didn't quite work in Mexico and in the same way as they did in America. And he said in America, it works because people have learned democracy. Democracy had been taught by practicing it. People in America were sort of left to their own devices. They had to have their own schools, they had to have their own churches. They typically would build these schools, churches, and they would have councils where they would actually learn by practice how to run these schools and how to run these churches. And therefore, through that learning democracy by practicing it, they became democratic. The problem, of course, in America now is they're no longer involved in those processes. So Tocqueville, as they would say in French, is still broadly correct. But whereas in Mexico, being a former Spanish colony, all the churches, by the way, if you go to Mexico, all the churches look the same because there was just one particular way that they were built, and the Spanish would come in and build them. And therefore, they didn't have if you like, sort of bottom-up element of it. And in order to look at how the modern Tocquevillians can engage, we then because we were sort of saying, well, what kind of chapter do we need? And then we came back and said, well, what about those ladies from the podcast? And then we contacted those ladies from the podcast.
Let John know that.
Well, I mean, these, you are,
I
I'm happy to be sort of like gender neutral or whatever it is. And I'm happy to call you women instead. Sorry, I was just trying to be polite, okay? And also a female from Italy, Donatella della Porta, who wrote about social movements, and Andrea, who's with that. And I think and of course you can talk about your own chapter, but also one of the things we also sort of came up with was that when we have all these institutions, the book was starting sort of to spiral out of control in a way, because we realized that we had not yet touched upon the, although what idealism was mentioned really, which was reinforced by your talk you gave the other day, Nicole, about the institutions that you have in places like the Philippines, which I would have to repeat what it was called again.
It's in Indonesia, Musyawarah.
And I even get places wrong. So some of those institutions should also be included because they can be added to, not an alternative to, but added to other forms of institutions. But the last chapter we then commissioned was a chapter by a lady called woman, female, individual, researcher, person, not a bot or something, Andrea Adamopoulos, and she had this line which she has in the book, that the process of voting is an artistic process, and I would sort of pretty much sort of leave it with that, because that sort of follows on from and raises the same questions as the ones that Camilla raised before, namely not necessarily the art of the process of voting, but maybe perhaps we could, sort of the essay question would be, the process of politics is an artistic process. And I suppose if I could sort of go back in my sort of university type of role, I would then maybe just add the word discuss after that.
So thank you very much, Matt, for listening to our podcast on democracy. And we're very grateful that it inspired you and your thinking. And I could also see our work being featured a lot in this new book. I just received my copy last week, and I had a chance to read quickly the introduction and conclusion. And introduction finishes with our work on what we are going to present now, and then conclusion refers back to our work. And you're like, wow, our work framed this book. And then I was telling this to Caroline this morning, and she's like, okay, then we need more than 10 minutes because we are given only 10 minutes today. So the chapter that we are going to present today is Performing Democracy Through Local Protests, the case of knitting nanas against gas. So our work on this chapter goes back to an ARC project, ARC discovery project we had together with Caroline some years ago, pre-COVID times, and looking at the coal seam gas controversy in Australia, particularly in New South Wales, and really thinking about what, if anything, deliberative democratic approach can offer to resolve environmental controversies like the coal seam gas debate. And in fact, we have a tradition in our center taking the deliberative democratic approach to really sort of hard conditions, difficult contexts, and trying to see if there is anything that can be gained from this approach in resolving deep disagreements and really contested issues like the coal seam gas debate in Australia and in other parts of the world as well, known as the fracking debate. So we had many field works with the team during this project, and it was partly it was a project that required a lot of technical knowledge as well, because we needed to understand the technology to say something about the environmental implications of that. And it's a very crowded space with lots of actors involved in shaping the debate, regulatory agencies, government agencies, and scientists, experts. But then during this time, during our field work, we also saw a lot of citizens' participation, a lot of different ways of participating in the controversy. And in the communities that we conducted field work on, mainly in New South Wales, on and around Narrabri, we met with lots of people who were setting up Facebook pages to bring awareness about the implications of the coal seam gas mining in their communities, really like with very little resources, and trying to express and amplify their opinions in very creative ways. So one particular group that attracted our attention, a social protest group in Australia, was the Knitting Nanas Against Gas. So the chapter is about this case study mainly. So if I can move forward. We were there in the field as scholars who are doing research on deliberative democracy and thinking about the ideal setting for deliberation, and really looking at whether our approach works in practice or what the practice might. Okay. Yeah. So what we were seeing, and I think everybody can observe this in other contexts and other controversies as well, was that there's a big change in where public deliberation takes place, and thinking about the work of Jürgen Habermas, who is the sort of the founding figure of deliberative democracy, defining the field, one of the important scholars, who also recently published another book on the new transformations of the public sphere. And he described in his seminal work on the public sphere the 18th century coffee houses as the ideal setting for public deliberation. And what we were seeing in the field, that it's not those coffee houses, we were still sort of seeing people who meet at the coffee houses, but these weren't the gentlemen that, ladies, these were ladies, these weren't the gentlemen that Habermas envisioned in his work, talking mainly sort of, on the one hand, he sort of talked about this high-level rational debate of an educated man. What we were seeing in practice and through our work is much more colorful, much more exciting than that. And we were seeing the medium of talk. Of course, people do talk to each other, but also we were seeing the repertoires, non-verbal repertoires, being used as a way of staging an argument and as a way of amplifying a position. And this is how we started studying the social protest group, the Knitting Nanas Against Gas. And our aim here was really also think about the relationship between those kind of protests and the broader deliberative democratic project. What, if anything, those kind of protest movements can add to our understanding of deliberative democracy. And Camilla mentioned a little bit about the tension between protest and deliberation as two different forms of participating in politics. And there are those articles in literature really contrasting protest and deliberation, saying one focuses on the rhetoric, other focuses on reason, passion, emotion versus rational, uncivil versus civil kind of political participation. And through our work, and we do show that protest and deliberation are not strange bedfellows, and we are not the only people who are presenting this kind of viewpoint. There is a lot of research that shows that deliberation occurs within protest, like there are some works looking at deliberation within the Occupy kind of social movements and Hong Kong democracy protests. There are some publications looking at how activists on the ground deliberate among themselves. And then we also know that even protests are not deliberative. They have implications for deliberation at the system level. So this is mainly the deliberative systems literature, looking at different components of the deliberative system and says, okay, so the individual components might not be deliberative, but they have contribution to deliberative systems as a whole. In this chapter, and more broadly in our understanding of the kind of the social protest movements like Knitting Nanas Against Gas, we ask, how can we make sense of the new protest movements from a deliberative perspective? And with this new protest movement, we have something more to say on this in the chapter. These are not the big kind of protest movements like in the 60s. They're more individualized. They rely on everyday forms of resistance and repertoires, and they also benefit from the information and communication technologies to mobilize others like-minded people and to form counter publics. We're also asking and interested in understanding what are the deliberative implications of these protests, these kind of protests, and finally we are interested in the question of what are the conditions under which protests enable rather than hinder the prospects of public deliberation. So, with this kind of agenda, really trying to understand where these new alternative forms of political participation and social protests fit within the broader picture of deliberative democracy, we're particularly interested in grassroots protests, that they are small scale, place-based, and they are sort of being enacted in everyday context. And this is very well exemplified in the protests of the Knitting Nanas Against Gas. So during our coal seam gas controversy project, we did a lot of interviews, and this chapter, our insights presented in this chapter also relies on our interviews and our participatory observation of 7, they call it knit-ins, knitting, how they stage their knitting in front of their local MP's office. They go and sit there on a regular basis, say every Friday at 2 p.m. and they just take their knitting kits together with them, and they knit yellow and black kind of objects and funny objects as well. And the reason they are using the colors of yellow and black because they are the colors of danger, and they want to signal the danger related to coal seam gas mining in their local communities. So on their sort of repertoires, how they do it, you can find more in the chapter. So we also use, as our analytical perspective, we use a dramaturgical analysis to flesh out the performative aspects of these protests. we can say a bit more about this kind of analysis, but our intention with this analysis was to capture also the nonverbal that are being staged as part of the protests, because you could talk to them, you could have an interview material, but without capturing the nonverbal aspects of the public deliberation, it sort of remains incomplete. So here are some photos. Here are some local cafe settings where these mainly elderly women meet on a sort of regular basis and knit. And here are two of the founders of the group in Lismore, and they also meet in their local club regularly, and they are very visible when you go to these spaces. And even if they are not doing anything, if they don't have any protest signs or anything, they just disrupt by their sort of being in those kind of everyday spaces and just sitting, wearing and that's why I'm wearing yellow today to be case study. So wearing a yellow hats and clothes, etc. And they have lots of souvenirs as well to give to the researchers and others. So I have some bags and knitted stuff from them as well. So I haven't done the latest check, but by the time we were writing this chapter, and our work on nanas is also one of our case studies in our book with John Boswell as well on mending democracy. So there were over 40 nana loops. This is how they call themselves in and across Australia. And it's really interesting in a sense. They are not coordinated. They call themselves a disorganization, and they just see each other's repertoire, and then someone starts a nana loop in one of the local communities, and then this is how they mushroom around Australia. And there are international examples as well. There are nanas in New Zealand and in the UK as well. Like there are nana groups for refugees as well. And what they sort of symbolize as being nana, etc. Caroline will speak a bit more about the symbolic significance of these kind of protests in a moment. So this is me in Lismore in front of the Federal MP's office after my interviews with these ladies on their protests, on their protest repertoires, and what, if anything, these kind of aesthetic, effective forms of communication adds to the debate, and the way they try to reconfigure the public sphere and put attention, for example, to future generations, whom they call as their grandkids or kiddies. So I'm going to hand it over to Caroline now to speak a little bit more about our chapter.
I'll keep it. I might only talk for 3 because we've opened it up. Thanks, Celine. So I just wanted to give you a bit about how we made sense of this disorganisation for the purpose of our analysis. And one of the things we do in this chapter is really focus in on local protests. So there's been empirical work done, particularly with the deliberative democracy lens, looking at particularly large national scale or even maybe regional protests. But we wanted to take a very sort of local look at this case study and ask the question around, is there something particular that local protests do and the way they work? And why are we asking this question? I guess because local groups tend to have kind of, they're operating in a context where they can't avoid each other, right? So these communities where nanas operate, or KNAG groups operate, tend to be divided by coal seam gas controversy. So in that divisive context, what does this connection to place and this sort of often strong social bonds mean for protest groups? And we're also wanting to ask questions around the centrality of place. So what does it mean to be in the landscape when the landscape itself is part of the contestation? So in the analysis, we use a sort of dramaturgical framework. So we look at this sort of staging, which is really about how is the performance constructed and where's it constructed. And you can see Selene's talked a bit about some of the symbols that they use and the colours, but also where they do their knitting. So a lot of their performance is centred around the activity of craft and making. And so Selene mentioned also that sometimes they sit outside, provocatively outside an MP's office. Sometimes they put a lot of paraphernalia to attract attention, to have conversations. Sometimes that's sitting is actually in a public meeting where you wouldn't be expected to knit. And so they violate sort of kind of conventions of I guess, in this case, a community consultation. It was a fairly formal public hearing. And they're not talking, they're not speaking, and they're just clicking their little knitting nails, but they're bearing witness is how they sort of describe it. So that's kind of around the staging and setting. What they also do, which is kind of maybe symbolised by this picture here, sometimes they position themselves on very busy thoroughfares, either in the towns, the pedestrian thoroughfares, or actually on the highway. So they're trying to grab attention, but not necessarily through always banners or provocation, but also more curiosity, trying to get people to say, what are those older women on the side of the street doing? What's going on? So they kind of use place and the staging of their protests to provoke inquiry. In the chapter, we look at the casting. So who are the characters in their performances? So the main character really is the Nana, the wise old woman who should know what the community needs. And so they really play on this very kind of conservative rural idea of the older woman and the Nana knowing best. And they play with that. They play with this character. But they also have other characters, supporting characters, which we sort of draw out, which are really the kiddies, the children, the future generations. And they use this language of kiddies rather than children or future generations to try and, again, label what these missing people from the debate are. They're kiddies that are vulnerable, and they need to be taken into account in the coal seam gas controversy. The third sort of angle of the analysis is around the scripting and how this is where I guess some of their more strategic work comes in. But they play a lot with humour, and they try and make their protests very inviting. So sometimes they're not even talking to people about coal seam gas. They're just trying to stop people in the street to have a conversation. So it's kind of very disarming way of being a protester. Almost the opposite of what Camilla was showing for some of the protest art. You know, it's a very different way of getting people to have conversations. So the context of this, as I mentioned before, is a very local, divided community where people go to the same schools, they see each other at the supermarket. So being too provocative, is not also in the interest of a lot of people. So trying to actually make it more approachable and more straightforward. So here are some of the props they use. They use a lot of craft, and at one point they had some knitted Barnaby Joyce's new baby, some little booties out of their colours. So they're quite, and then they post that. So they use the physical, but then they project it onto the virtual. I knit, I protest, I also vote. So they play with the idea that they're kind of mad women, and they like that. I guess we draw the chapter together by sort of saying that a lot of all this sort of staging and the craft and the characters, it opens up the public sphere to a particular kind of expression that in this very crowded space. This is the crowded controversy with lots of communication going on. They're trying to find a niche in that communication space, and so they're using alternative forms of expression, but they're also trying to inject new or excluded voices. So that's the kiddies, the future generations, into the debate who don't have a voice typically in those very conventional forums, and they're also trying to facilitate a debate on an uncomfortable topic in a divided community. So those are the ways they do that, enable those. We've got some pictures here of the other sort of kinds of protests that use, again, this sort of performative way of getting messages across. I guess just to conclude, because I'm conscious we are needing to open it up. I guess we look at and draw out some of this place-based way of performing and how important place is to these local protests, and the use of aesthetic and effective forms of communication. And then I guess we sort of end a bit on a methodological point, which is that, you know, in order to understand this broader effective aesthetic dimension of deliberative systems, we need to also have, we'll understand deliberation in that broader sense, but we need methods to be able to understand those repertoires beyond the speech and the text.